Welcome to the Proceedings podcast. I'm Bill Hamblett, the editor-in-chief at the U.S. Naval Institute. It's Friday, April 10th, 2026. Good to have you on board, everyone. This episode is brought to you by Booz Allen. From rugged 5G on warships to unmanned systems deep below the ocean, Booz Allen builds technology that works where it matters most. Their AI-driven, mission-ready capabilities help the U.S. Navy operate and win in contested environments. No manual, no roadmap, no problem. Learn more at boozallen.com/defense. All right, the U.S.-Israel war with Iran has been in a ceasefire status for almost 3 days now. My colleagues Bill Bray and Brian O'Rourke are joining me today for a quick roundtable on the situation. Bill is a retired Navy captain and deputy editor-in-chief of Proceedings, and Brian has just moved up to the managing editor position for Proceedings. So Bill, Brian, welcome.
Afternoon, Bill.
All right, so we wanted to talk about a few aspects of the war so far, including the current status of the Strait of Hormuz. And just a reminder for our audience, the Naval Institute is a nonpartisan, nonprofit, apolitical organization. So we're going to avoid partisan politics and focus on the military, tactical, and operational details. And we'll start first with what has most surprised you in the war so far. And I'll go first. And for me, it's the sheer number of reported strikes. So U.S. Central Command's website, I just checked it before we went live here, says 13,000 targets have been struck. And that is a staggering number of targets. As somebody who spent a good part of my career as a Navy targeteer and an Air Wing intelligence officer, and yet I also think it shows the limits of air power because Iran seems a bit undaunted going into the negotiations and where it sits diplomatically in this ceasefire right now. And I was also surprised by the sheer number of aircraft and special forces involved in the rescue of the U.S. Air Force F-15 Eagle, Strike Eagle, the weapons systems officer, when that aircraft was shot down a week ago, and then the rescue that happened on Easter Sunday. I've been reading that more than 100 aircraft plus special forces were involved in the rescue. And in my career as an Air Wing intelligence officer, I did a lot of combat search and rescue planning during my career. But the size of the rescue package for this operation in Iran was at least 3 or 4 times what I would have expected. I was kind of blown away by the numbers. So from my perspective, so far the numbers have just kind of shocked me. 13,000 targets and more than 100 aircraft on one rescue mission. How about you, Bill?
I have to say I'm not that surprised by that much. I mean, the sheer scope of the targeting is a good one, because I didn't really think about that, except we know that the plans for this has been worked on for decades and constantly are redone. I will say I think I was a little surprised that we seem we weren't really prepared, I don't think, or at least not from the public information that I can gather, and got to qualify anything I say with I don't have full information inside with the Strait of Hormuz, becoming such an issue. I first went through there in 1991. Was a surface warfare officer. Iran was far less capable militarily back then. The Iran-Iraq War had only been over for 3 years at that point. And the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, I guess, had just ended. And we, tried to know everything we could know about the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, it was always an issue. And over the years, it's always been thought, and I'm sure CENTCOM anticipated this possibility. I don't think, I'm not sure what you can do about it without taking a lot of risk to force. And so you either have to take that risk of force and do it and clear it and keep the queue routes open and all that stuff, or you have to negotiate some solution to it. And that's kind of where we are right now. As Bill, you guys know, we just published a retired Navy JAG, just went up on our website just a few minutes ago on the international legal standard for the strait that the United States has, and the world, not just the United States, has insisted upon for more than 70 years. So it predates the Islamic Republic. Even under the Shah's regime, Iran would periodically try to claim that the Strait of Hormuz is territorial water, that they can then, you could use innocent passage instead of transit passage, which is a distinction in international sea law. And the U.S. has always said, no, it's not. It's an international strait. And like I think the author said, there was 200 of these or so around the world. That's the law of the sea, and so we've stood to that. And I hope we don't back off that.
Yeah, right. It shouldn't be any different than the Strait of Malacca, the Strait of Gibraltar,
That's right.
The Taiwan Strait, et cetera, right? I mean, this is it should be open and free for movement of shipping from all nations without any kind of a toll booth, without any kind of impingement. Yeah, agree. Brian, surprises to you?
I guess sort of connected to what Bill Bray was just saying. It's surprising to me we've heard fewer calls from some of the usual quarters for the United States to actually join the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Some of these, as happens every time there's even just freedom of navigation operations or other sorts of things, there's the paradox that the United States is seeking to enforce something it acknowledges as customary law, but where its position would be stronger if it were formal black letter law for the United States. So lesser things than this often trigger those calls, and I've heard very little about it, even as the ceasefire holds and traffic still stagnates outside the strait. I was sort of anticipating it. It hasn't come.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, right? We would have expected to see some commentaries on our website, on our social media channels, perhaps even, somebody writing a quick article for us on the need, the necessity, the urgency for the United States to finally ratify the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Let's talk a little bit more in depth about the Strait of Hormuz right now. Our colleagues at USNI News have been covering this very closely. And in a story that they ran 2 days ago, so it was just 24 hours into the ceasefire, they quoted, I think it was a Shell oil source who said, described the strait as both open and closed depending on your position geographically and geopolitically. A Schrodinger's strait, if you will, referring to the philosophical conundrum of Schrodinger's box, whether it's, is it open or closed, right? And the strait is at this point both open and closed, depending on who you talk to. The Iranians are calling it open, but they're also enforcing what people are calling the Tehran toll booth. And shipping so far going through has been very limited, less than probably 10% what it should be, what it was on a normal day pre-war. So Bill, we were just talking about this, and you mentioned an article that we just published today. Retired Navy JAG officer Captain Dolan, and he specifically points out the points in international maritime law, and says the United States should not let that become the new status quo. So give us a little bit more, because you edited his piece on those specific comments that he makes.
Yeah, so it actually was a bit of a refresher for me. It's been a long time, and so that's good. But so people are familiar, I think, more familiar with the term innocent passage. So innocent passage is that ships are allowed to pass through a nation's territorial waters when they're going from point A to point B in international waters. And so it means that people don't have to spend more money basically to go around these things if they're just going to. Now, you can't loiter in it, you can't do things in it for no good reason, but you can pass. So that's innocent passage. The thing about innocent passage is, under international law, a country can suspend innocent passage if their security is threatened. So this is what Iran wants. They want the Strait of Hormuz to be considered under the innocent passage regime, not transit passage. Transit passage is the countries, and it's not just Iran. It could be Oman too, to the south of in the southern, say, can suspend passage through there, or put other conditions on it, like pay us a tax or something, or check in with us, or tell us you're coming through, and all that stuff. So the U.S. position has always been it's an international strait. International straits under international law are governed by the transit passage regime, not innocent passage. So think about. So to me, when I'm just following the news like everybody here, Iran sees an opening here because of they see that they're reviving this position that is, again, it's decades old, that they've looked to use the Strait of Hormuz as probably a money maker for one reason, but also and they see an opening here to try to put this on the table. And in fact, it was in their 10 points or whatever it was, a proposal. So, Captain Dolan, as a retired JAG and has got a lot of experience with this, saw that immediately. So, see, this is what they're doing. And he's worried, without getting into politics, I don't want to get into politics, but he's worried that the United States might actually agree that this is on the table. And the United States has not said specifically we're agreeing to that.
Right.
They've made a general statement that the plan is quote unquote workable from a standpoint of starting the negotiation. So it may very well be that the administration says that one is not happening, at all. So I don't want to suggest that they are. I'm just saying that it is kind of a ball in play right now.
Right. And if the danger there, I mean, there's a lot of danger, but one of the dangers is that you could be setting a precedent that other countries could take advantage of. Notably, in my mind, is the Taiwan Strait, and that the Chinese could say, no, this is an innocent passage regime through here, or certain places in the South China Sea where they control a group of islands, and they might decide that this is no longer transit passage, this is innocent passage, and therefore we have a say in who gets to go and under what conditions and all those kinds of things. So it's a slippery slope. Could be a slippery slope to move in that direction. Brian, any thoughts?
Well, yeah, I mean, I haven't read the Iran proposal, the component of the proposal Bill's referring to with the innocent passage regime. The other thing I've heard discussed in this context is the Montreux Convention that governs the Dardanelles, where it isn't an innocent passage regime, but Turkey has the ability to control military traffic through it, somewhat akin to an innocent passage scenario, and that might have been one of the big diplomatic mistakes of the early 20th century for a lot of purposes, that it was a mistake Churchill made and that the United States should be wary of. And so that's sort of carrying it a little bit further, where it could be possible to inadvertently negotiate our way into a corner like that. It's another reason in my mind, not to come back to UNCLOS, but it's another reason to be thinking about that, because it gets people in a different mindset about what the rules are and understand that there is a governing set of rules. It isn't all negotiable all the time. And adopting the convention could help focus our minds a little bit on that better, I think.
Yeah, and to your point on UNCLOS, for people who are wondering why has the United States not, is not a signatory to UNCLOS, it goes back to, so UNCLOS dates to 1982, and the opposition goes back to just one specific, from what I understand, a specific clause or section of UNCLOS, which had to do with deep seabed mining. And at the time, and in the wording of UNCLOS, it basically demanded that countries who had the deep seabed mining technology, the ability to do mining on the deep seabed for these manganese nodules, cobalt nodules, et cetera, that you had to share that technology with the rest of the world. And at the time, the United States was one of, if not the only country that had that technology. And so there was a group of senators who said, oh, hell no, No international UN regulation is going to tell us what technology we have to just share with and give away to the rest of the world. We had an article by our Navy FEF, Jim Halsell, right? Thank you. In the January issue about deep seabed mining, and he mentions that. And Jim is working on his PhD, and this is his area of study. And Jim points out that in 2025, 2026, that technology has already proliferated to many countries around the world. So, the opposition that the U.S. feels to that particular part of the treaty is kind of overcome by events by now, because many, not only countries, but companies, large companies, have that technology. And I have to think, I almost wonder if there was some aspect of senior leaders in the Senate who were aware of the Glomar Explorer and the U.S. mission and the cover story for bringing up the K-129, the Soviet ballistic missile submarine. If that wasn't in their mind when they thought, oh no, we're not giving that technology away, right? So anyway, I don't know that, but I have to think that could have been part of the reason not to support UNCLOS at the time. But I will point out, and this is true for Bill in my career, every CNO in the last since the 1980s has advocated that the United States should be a signatory to UNCLOS, that it should be ratified by the Senate, because we do treat it as customary law. We abide by the UN conventional law to see whether the United States has signed it or not. So anyway, it's always a good point. It's always sort of lurking, the idea of UNCLOS. And it's a key thing that when we point out behaviors by the Iranians, by the Chinese, by other regimes that is in violation of UNCLOS, they will point to us and say, well, we're a signatory to it and you're not, right? So you don't really even have the right to complain about another nation's behavior under UNCLOS. You didn't even sign it. You're not even a signatory to it.
Anyway. And speaking of things prohibited by UNCLOS, let's talk about mining the Strait of Hormuz. Not deep sea mining, but strait mining.
Yeah, exactly. So, I talked about this about a week and a half ago. I had retired Vice Admiral Fozzie Miller, former Fifth Fleet commander, on the show. And, he described, a lot of people, obviously there's the focus on mines and the threat of mines. And when I talked to him, he described, the fact that this is a campaign plan. It's no surprise to anybody who's been involved in planning and military planning against Iran for the last, 2 or 3 decades, that reopening the strait in a situation where we went to war. Mines were obviously a threat, but Admiral Miller described it as a threat stack, a stack of threats that you have to sort of peel back this onion, and mines might be the center of that layer. And then on top of the mines is the fast attack craft, the bog hammer kind of threat, these vessels that can come at you at 40 or 50 knots, armed with all sorts of different weapons, and then backed up by coastal defense cruise missiles, backed up by Shahed drones and ballistic missiles. And we've seen a lot of that in the last 3 years in the Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea from the Houthis, who got all those threat capabilities from the Iranians. And so in order to clear, if there are mines, in order to clear those mines, you have to first suppress all of those capabilities so that your mine countermeasures forces, which don't move quickly, by the way, and are fairly limited. And, the finding, fixing, and then clearing of mines is something that happens, I don't want to say snail's pace, but it happens pretty slowly and meticulously. It doesn't happen at 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 knots, right? It happens pretty slowly. So, Bill, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So we know Iran has a lot of mines. We know that they've been focused on that, having that capability for years. I think about this, and unlike coastal defense cruise missiles or small boat attacks, those threats you can turn on and off quickly. You can launch missiles and then stop launching them. You can order a small ballistic attack and then call it back or not do it. Once you put mines in the water, it's you can't undo it. And of course, Iran's thinking here, well, if we can get an agreement, then we need to export our oil too. So we need to get it out of the strait. So if you pull the mine card out, my feeling is, and I'm not a mine maker expert, that you do that, you're talking about a long time before commercial shipping would feel comfortable going through there. There would have to be, we'd have to have some deal with the Iranians probably to clear it with their help, or at least they agree not to attack our clearing capability. Europeans may come in and help, etc. But so that's, I feel like the mine is it's not quite the last resort card, but it's close.
Anybody who grew up watching Gilligan's Island knows what you're talking about with those lines persisting for a long time.
Okay,
another thing that has come up in that conversation, there's a lot of questions. We've been fielding a lot of questions from general purpose press, the broader press, is what's the ability of the United States Navy to deal with that threat, to deal with the mine threat, and notably the 4 Avenger class mine countermeasure ships that were stationed in Fifth Fleet, stationed in Bahrain for years and years, were sent home, late last year and arrived in Philadelphia on a heavy lift ship. Just was it in February or January? Not very long ago, not long before this happened. And what we have now deployed as part of Fifth Fleet are 3 littoral combat ships, the Independence class littoral combat ships, which have a mine countermeasures package, which took a long time to get that mine countermeasures package, which consists of a lot of different things: unmanned surface vessels, some unmanned underwater vessels. They've got a helicopter capability that can go out and find. And then there's some special forces EOD capabilities to once mines have been found and isolated, located, that they can be destroyed or can be dealt with. But it's 3 ships, right? 3 ships, and notably 2 of those ships were spotted in Singapore, refueling, bunkering, whatever, as the war kind of kicked off. So they weren't even really in theater when this thing started. And there's a lot of speculation about, why would that be? Well, probably because they had to get them out of Bahrain. They wanted to get them out of Bahrain before the conflict started so that they would be available and certainly wouldn't be under threat from the Iranians when things kicked off. But also they could be in Singapore because I think U.S. military people and planners knew it'd take a while before we were ready to peel back that threat stack, as Admiral Miller described it, and get the mine countermeasure ships in there. USNI News reported that after the ceasefire, the Iranians said, "Oh, there are mines out there," which is why the ships have now got a route in this area very close into Iranian territorial waters, up around some of the islands that are closer to the coast, rather than the main traffic separation scheme. And so the few ships that are going through the strait seem to be moving through that route rather than through the normal traffic separation scheme. I noticed that Sal Mercogliano, who we are following his Twitter feed very closely in all of this, and he goes by WGOW shipping, what's going on with shipping. And Sal is a proceedings author of several times, has a very successful YouTube channel, and is probably one of the greatest experts on this, particularly on maritime shipping around the world. So Sal, thanks for joining us today. You could probably correct 3 or 4 of the things that we've already said, but it's great to have you on. Anyway, Brian, any thoughts on mine warfare?
It's bad. I think it illustrates what we've been saying for a long time in our pages, or rather authors have been saying for a long time on our pages, that it's the cheapest, easiest way to do things. And I agree with Bill Bray. They haven't played that card very fully yet. Holding it in reserve is probably a good strategic move, but the simple threat of it is enough to slow everything to a halt. People are afraid to take their ships through. The notion that there's one mine afloat means there's probably more mines afloat, and you have to, or on the seabed, and you have to avoid them. Sandy Woodward's famous quip that every ship can be a minesweeper once is very much in people's minds with things like this. And hopefully this will be a spur to enhance the mine countermeasures capabilities the Navy has. The new littoral combat ship module based on the Common Unmanned Surface Vehicle seems like a good option. We'll find out for real soon enough. It won't be sweeping off San Diego for looking for test things. It'll be doing the real job, and hopefully it's as up to the task as testing suggests it will be.
Yeah, the Navy tends to get religion about mine warfare. Every 30 or 40 years, we certainly got religion after Gulf War I, Desert Storm, when we had the USS Tripoli and the USS Princeton hit mines, and Samuel Roberts during the Iran-Iraq War. There was a big effort to establish a mine warfare command down in Texas. I remember back in the 1990s, and then it sort of withered. It withers when budgets wither, right? And so one of the first things that we tend to cut is focus on mine warfare so that we can maintain and preserve shipbuilding. But we lose sight of it, at our own risk, at our own peril, for certain. Let's talk for a few minutes about areas of greatest concern, or what you think might what might come next that worries you.
Well,
Bill?
I'd like to go back to the first thing you talked about, Bill, which was the 13,000 targets, and it reminded me a little bit of a completely different situation in many ways, but is the Balkans War, especially Kosovo. We ran out of targets. Ran out of legitimate military targets is what I mean. And
without winning, right? And that still hadn't.
Right. So you get to a point where it's like there's not much left to bomb, and there's pop-up targets here and there, but it's not. And that's why you kind of heard, the secretary and others saying, well, there's dual use, bridges and things like that. I'm not a JAG. I'm not an expert. I do teach just war theory at the Naval Academy. We had a good discussion in the class yesterday about some of this, but which is, what happens when you really are out of targets and the regime is still standing and they've taken the best punch and I kind of feel like we're almost at that point. You can either negotiate a solution, have some, status like we had way back in the Southern Watch days, where you just have this state of play where you, to borrow the Israeli term, mow the lawn every now and then, keep bombing when they start to build stuff back up. Of course, you got the Strait of Hormuz problem, which makes that difficult, right? So you're looking for a way to resolve it, or you have to take some more aggressive military action and to actually physically remove the regime, which I don't think anybody thinks that's a good idea. So, that's the problem here. It's a difficult problem, but I get the sense that there isn't much left to bomb.
There was 2 or 3 months into the Afghanistan war, somebody put that question to Donald Rumsfeld at a press conference. Said, you seem to be running out of targets. And Rumsfeld paused and corrected them and said, let me be clear, we're not running out of targets. The Taliban are running out of targets. And it was a good line. It was good for the home front and everything, but it did obscure the fact that what do you do when you've killed everything you can legitimately kill, but you haven't killed the regime, you haven't killed the entity. And that, I think, is my big concern about what's next, Bill, is what happens if the religious leaders are less powerful but still influential, and the IRGC really becomes the central player as opposed to one of the competing centers of power, which is I'm no Iran expert, but that's been my perception, is that there's been a bit of a jockeying for position over the years, and I don't know whether it's better or worse to have the IRGC calling more of the shots, but it seems worse from my limited perspective. Maybe one of you has a different thought on that or a different take on that.
Yeah, I've had a lot of conversations. In fact, I was involved with the Naval Academy Foreign Affairs Conference this week, which is it was about 170 or 80 midshipmen and students from other universities, NROTC, West Point, Air Force Academy, foreign military academies. And you would, of course, this topic was front of mind for everybody. And the discussion came up about the next kinds of targets, and as we were starting that conference on Tuesday, when the president was making really big threats about Iranian civilization, and so there was some confusion among students, as I'm sure Midshipman Hamlet would have been confused at the time, about whether striking things like bridges and power plants would be some sort of a war crime, right? And I have been a targeteer. I have been through joint targeting school. And there's certainly lots and lots of examples in war from World War II on where the United States and others have struck things like bridges and power plants. Those are dual use targets. They are legitimate military targets. The military extracts value out of being able to move things across bridges and railroad lines and substations, switching stations, power stations. But the risk there is always that you do so much damage to the country and to the economy that then what are you left with afterwards? And having to rebuild it, having to you end up in almost like a no-win situation. Sure, we've shut down all your bridge traffic, but at the same time, we've left a country that's going to need incredible amount of help and assistance to come back afterwards, which I think everyone would like to see Iran come back into the Brotherhood of Nations, but just under different management, right? So yeah, that's certainly that's what's on my mind as we're in this ceasefire. What comes next, and if the ceasefire doesn't lead to some sort of a negotiated settlement, and we end up being back into a hot war, like, okay, what comes next? Because as you point out, Bill, it's a great line. The adversary has taken taken a pretty big punch and is still standing. So where do you go from here?
Yeah, and there was real quick to follow up on that. There was an article in the Atlantic the other day. I can't remember the author's name, but an Iran expert, and the author's point was that pain on the people is good for the IRGC, not bad. Their ability to be, that is sort of underpins their legitimacy in a sense, which is, and that's why one of the underlying principles of the going back to the JICPOA was keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, relax the sanctions, let their economy improve, let the people taste it. And that, because Iran has a pretty vibrant civil society, as we saw just this winter with all the protests. And now that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work, and it's certainly, but it's one approach. If the idea that I think you can just make everyone's life miserable and the IRGC is going to say, you know what, we can't take it anymore, I think that's not going to happen.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think we saw that for decades of sanctions and just tight restrictions on the North Korea, right? Is that the sanctions made things really miserable for the average person, but it didn't seem to loosen the amount of control that the regime had, on the country overall. It didn't make their lives miserable. It made the average person's life pretty miserable and under even tighter, more strict control.
I want to take a second. This isn't a call-in show, which is unfortunate because Sal Mercogliano has joined us in the chat, and he has promised an update on innocent passage versus transit passage in his next update. So thanks for joining us, Sal. We appreciate you being here, and we'll try to get you on again sometime soon.
Yeah, and I'll point out another question that we've gotten from the chat is axioms of dominion. People keep talking about our decades of plans, yet somehow we never got a proper drone doctrine. Iranian drones aren't particularly impressive from a technical or production perspective, but why don't we have a proper drone system or counter drone system? And I think that's it's a really great point. From everything I've been reading, and in fact, we've had quite a few authors address the idea of drone warfare, and what we're all learning from the Ukrainians, right? That what's happened, the ability of the Ukrainians to adapt in this mode of warfare has surprised everybody. It certainly surprised the Russians, but I think it's surprised the United States, and we're almost taking our lead off of that. And you've been reading about how Ukrainian advisors have been in a lot of the Gulf cooperation countries, states in the last month, advising UAE and Qatar and Saudi on how to deal with Iranian drones that are part of this war. So I think there's a lot of learning that's happening, and a lot of folks are studying what's been happening on the battlefield in Ukraine, Russia, Ukraine.
One of the underreported drone things is, it has certainly been reported, but not very extensively, is the U.S. Department of War is producing its own Shahed drones. They've captured a few and reverse engineered them, and they've been used in combat. It's called the LUCAS, the Low Cost Unmanned Combat Attack System. So, our adversaries are learning from us, and we are showing the ability to learn from them. So.
All right. Well, we are kind of running out on time. I didn't want to stretch this out too long. Any saved rounds before we close off today, Brian?
Just eager to see what happens. It's always a fascinating thing to open the morning headlines before I get out of bed and wish I'd close my eyes and go back to sleep.
May you live in interesting times. We are certainly doing that. Bill, how about you?
Yeah, I'm very interested in the Navy force posture going forward here as the ceasefire goes on, and the negotiations led by the vice president take place. The Ford went into Croatia to get all that damage repaired from the fire, and I believe the USS George H.W. Bush is now deployed off the East Coast, and so Ford is on a timeline for like 11-month deployment at this point, and so that's interesting to me. And we all talked in other places recently about the wear and tear on the force and the effect on retention and the personnel effect. It comes with a cost.
Yeah, even the CNO at our Maritime Security Dialogue last Tuesday, so about 10 days ago now, he recognized that and didn't slough it off. Right, he was asked about impacts on readiness, about the Ford, and he said, of course we'd prefer to keep our carriers on a 7-month deployment cycle, not a 10 or 11-month deployment. That's tough on them, and he said, we're churning through a lot of munitions in this fight. About 800 Tomahawk land attack missiles so far is just one example of a exquisite weapon system that needs to be reloaded into the magazine. That's part of the $1.5 trillion budget request that has dropped, is for something like about almost 800 Tomahawk land attack missiles to replenish that stock for the Navy. So that is certainly something, that conversation. And again, our colleagues over at USNI News are covering the budget request in great depth and detail. We'll be watching that. I'm going to do an episode of the podcast with Senator Tim Sheehy, Republican of Montana, who sits on the Senate Armed Services Committee. He'll be in our house on Monday, the 13th of April, just a few days from now. And I plan to talk a lot about the defense budget, the request, what he sees as the most important priorities, and what he'll be trying to make sure gets shepherded through to success in the fall in that budget process for 2027. So anyway, this is a great conversation. Thanks, guys, and to the folks who joined logged in and joined us live. This was great. We'll probably have to do more of this. Appreciate the questions, and stay tuned for what comes next. All right. This episode was brought to you by Booz Allen. From rugged 5G on warships to unmanned systems deep below the ocean, Booz Allen builds technology that works where it matters most. Their AI-driven, mission-ready capabilities help the U.S. Navy operate and win in contested environments. No manual, no roadmap, no problem. Learn more at boozallen.com/defense. If you like the show, ring the bell, subscribe, tell a friend. Until next episode, remember, victory begins at the Naval Institute.